The gate wouldn't budge, not even a little, when I pressed the remote for the fourth time that morning. Sitting in my truck at 7:15 with a load of fencing supplies in the bed and a job site waiting 40 minutes away. I climbed out, walked up to the keypad mounted on the post, and found a small printed notice taped to the front of it, informing residents that access had been temporarily suspended pending resolution of an outstanding association matter. My name is Desmond Kessler. I'm 61 years old, and I spent 34 years working as a civil engineer specializing in road construction and right-of-way design before retiring 4 years ago. Work that took me through more county recorders' offices and easement disputes than I could easily count over the course of a career. I bought a small parcel at the end of a private road called Belhaven Lane about 6 years ago, drawn to the property specifically because it sat at the very end of that road, quiet, and set apart from the newer gated development that had grown up around it in recent years. That development is called Emberwood Ridge, and its homeowners association had, over the 2 years leading up to that morning at the locked gate, developed an increasingly firm conviction that Belhaven Lane, the road running past my property and continuing on to their own subdivision entrance, belonged entirely to their community, subject to whatever rules and restrictions their board saw fit to impose on anyone using it, myself included. I want to explain the history here, because it matters enormously to everything that unfolded that morning and in the weeks that followed. Belhaven Lane wasn't built by Emberwood Ridge's developer at all. It was built in 1968 by my own late father, a road construction contractor himself, who owned the parcel my house now sits on along with a considerably larger tract of land at the time. He built that road privately to access his own property, graded it properly, laid a gravel base that's held up remarkably well for over 5 decades, and recorded a deed reflecting his ownership of the road itself as an appurtenance to his land, the same way any private landowner constructing their own access road would typically do. When my father eventually sold off the larger tract decades later, keeping only the smaller parcel where my house now stands, the road itself remained his property, later passing to me through inheritance the same way the house did. The buyer of that larger tract eventually developed it into what became Emberwood Ridge, and as part of that development, my father, then still living, granted the new subdivision a recorded easement permitting their residents to use Belhaven Lane for access to the county highway, since building an entirely separate entrance road would have been considerably more expensive for the developer than simply securing permission to use the existing one. That easement critically granted a right of use. It did not grant ownership, and it did not grant Emberwood Ridge any authority whatsoever to install a gate, restrict access, or impose rules on a road that remained, in every legal sense, my private property. The gate itself had gone up about 18 months before that morning, installed by the Emberwood Ridge Homeowners Association without, as far as I could tell at the time, any direct conversation with me about it whatsoever. I remember the first time I encountered it, an automated arm barrier with a keypad, and being handed an access code by a neighbor who assumed, reasonably enough given how confidently the association had rolled the whole thing out, that this was simply how things worked now. I didn't love it, but I didn't fight it either, not initially. The gate didn't stop me from reaching my own property, and I've never been the kind of man who picks a fight over inconvenience alone. What changed my thinking entirely was a dispute, roughly a year later, over a landscaping truck that had used Belhaven Lane to access my property for a fence repair job. A truck the association's board decided, without any advance notice to me, violated what they called their commercial vehicle access policy, resulting in a formal warning letter addressed to me personally, informing me that continued violations could result in restricted gate access. I remember reading that letter and thinking, with the particular clarity that comes from 3 decades of professional experience in exactly this kind of dispute, that something about the entire arrangement had drifted a long way from what the original easement my father granted had ever actually authorized. I pulled my father's original file on Bellhaven Lane out of a filing cabinet in my garage that same evening. The same meticulous records he'd kept throughout his entire career, a habit I'd inherited fully myself. The recorded deed sat right there, exactly as I remembered it, establishing his ownership of the road as an appurtenant easement benefiting his own parcel, along with the later recorded grant permitting Emberwood Ridge residents a right of use for ingress and egress. Nothing more expansive than that. Nowhere in either document did I find any language authorizing a gate, any transfer of maintenance responsibility, or any grant of regulatory authority over vehicles using the road. The easement, in plain terms, gave Emberwood Ridge residents permission to drive on my road to reach their own community. It did not make the road theirs, and it certainly didn't grant their homeowners association the power to install a locked gate controlling access to property that remained, in full legal terms, mine. I called an attorney the following week, a careful, thorough woman named Perpetua Alderidge, whose name I'd been given by a former colleague who'd worked with her on a right-of-way dispute years earlier. I laid out the full history for her, the original deed, the easement grant, and the gate that had gone up without any real consultation with the one person who actually owned the underlying property. "This is about as clear an overreach as I've seen," Perpetua told me, after reviewing the documents I sent over. "An easement for ingress and egress grants a right to pass through. It does not grant the dominant estate, in this case Emberwood Ridge, any authority to install access controls on land they don't own, particularly not controls that could restrict the servient estate owner's own access to his own property." I asked her what that meant in practical terms. "It means," she said, "that gate, as currently operated, likely exceeds what the recorded easement actually authorizes, and depending on how aggressively the association enforces it against you going forward, you may have grounds for both an injunction and damages if they ever actually succeed in locking you out entirely." I want to be honest that I didn't immediately escalate things after that conversation with Perpetua. I'm not a man who enjoys conflict for its own sake, and despite everything I'd found in my father's old files, I genuinely hoped the situation might resolve itself once I simply explained the actual property history to the association directly, the same courteous way I'd have approached any professional dispute over the course of my career. I requested a meeting with the Emberwood Ridge Board, and was granted 20 minutes at their next regularly scheduled session, sitting across from a woman named Regina Thackeray, who'd served as association president for just over 3 years. I laid out the history calmly, the 1968 deed, my father's original construction of the road, and the later easement granting only a right of use rather than any transfer of ownership. Regina listened politely enough, but her response revealed exactly how entrenched the association's own understanding of the situation had become. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "the association has maintained and improved that road for going on 15 years now, resurfacing, drainage work, the gate installation itself. We consider that road community infrastructure at this point, regardless of what an old deed from the 60s might technically say." I explained, as patiently as I could manage, that maintenance and improvement, however extensive, doesn't transfer legal ownership of land, absent a proper recorded conveyance, something I'd spent 34 years of my professional career explaining to exactly this kind of well-intentioned but legally mistaken party. Regina thanked me for my time, said the board would take my concerns under advisement, and the meeting ended without any actual commitment to change anything about how the gate operated. The situation might have continued drifting along in that same uneasy, unresolved state indefinitely, had it not been for the landscaping truck dispute recurring roughly 4 months later, this time involving a delivery of lumber for a small addition I was building onto my garage. The association issued a second formal warning, considerably sharper in tone than the first, and informed me that continued commercial vehicle traffic could result in my personal gate access code being suspended entirely. I want to explain why that particular threat crossed a line that mere inconvenience never had. Suspending my access code wouldn't just inconvenience a delivery truck. It would potentially prevent me from reaching my own house, built on land my own family had owned and developed decades before Emberwood Ridge ever existed, over a road my father had built with his own construction equipment, using a gate the association had installed on my property without any properly negotiated agreement authorizing them to control access to it in the first place. I called Perpetua again, and this time we moved considerably more formally. She drafted a letter to the Emberwood Ridge Board, laying out the full recorded history of the property, the actual scope of the easement grant, and a formal demand that the association either negotiate a proper, compensated agreement addressing gate operation and maintenance responsibility, acknowledging my underlying ownership of the road, or remove the gate entirely and restore my unrestricted access to my own property. The board's response, when it finally arrived through their own attorney, attempted to argue that 15 years of continuous association maintenance and control over Belhaven Lane had established what they characterized as a prescriptive claim to the road, essentially arguing that their long-standing, open use and improvement of the property had ripened into something approaching ownership regardless of what the original recorded documents actually said. Perpetua's response to that argument, which I found genuinely satisfying given my own professional background in exactly this kind of dispute, pointed out plainly that a prescriptive claim requires use that is hostile to the actual owner's interest, meaning without permission. Emberwood Ridge's use of Belhaven Lane had never been hostile in that legal sense. It had been expressly permitted, under a recorded easement my own father had granted decades earlier, which meant their maintenance and improvement of the road, however extensive, occurred entirely within the scope of a permission they'd been given, not despite my family's ownership, but because of the very easement that acknowledged it. That distinction, small as it might sound outside a courtroom, effectively demolished the association's entire legal theory, and Perpetua noted in her formal response that continuing to restrict my access under an unauthorized gate could expose the association to meaningful liability, particularly given that I could document, through my own professional engineering background no less, that the gate itself sat entirely within the boundaries of my recorded property, not merely along some shared or ambiguous section of road. The morning the gate finally wouldn't open at all, the morning that printed notice about temporary suspension pending resolution of an outstanding association, matter greeted me at the keypad, turned out to be the final escalation before everything came to a head. I called Perpetua from my truck, still parked in front of that locked gate with a load of fencing supplies going nowhere, and she advised me to document everything, photograph the notice, note the time, and avoid any confrontation with whoever I might encounter, since we now had more than enough grounds to seek an emergency court order if the association intended to make good on actually locking me out of my own property entirely. I want to note that I never did need that emergency order in the end. Word of the situation reached Terrence Whitfield, a board member I hadn't dealt with directly before, who happened to review the full file Perpetua had submitted and immediately recognized, based on his own background working in county planning years earlier, exactly how weak the association's legal position actually was. Terrence called an emergency board session that same afternoon, and according to Regina Thackeray herself, who I spoke with briefly once the whole matter had settled, the conversation in that closed session grew considerably tense once Terrence laid out, plainly, that continuing to restrict a property owner's access to his own house, built on land his family had owned since before their subdivision existed, over a road they held only a limited-use easement to rather than actual title, was the kind of legal exposure no association's insurance policy was going to comfortably absorb if it ever escalated into formal litigation. The gate reopened by that same evening, and within the following month, working through Perpetua's office, Emberwood Ridge and I finalized a proper, formally recorded agreement addressing exactly what the original easement had left ambiguous. The association retained its right of use for ingress and egress, and in exchange for a modest, formally documented compensation, reflecting the road's ongoing maintenance burden that I agreed to share proportionally going forward. The gate would remain in place, but with my own access permanently guaranteed, unconditional, and never again subject to suspension by board vote or any interpretation of commercial vehicle policy applied to deliveries or contractors visiting my own property. Regina Thackeray stepped down from the board presidency a few months later, in circumstances that residents I spoke with described simply as a natural end to her term rather than any dramatic forced resignation, though I suspect the whole gate dispute did little to encourage her towards seeking another term regardless of how it was officially characterized. I still drive down Belhaven Lane every morning, through the same gate that once nearly locked me out of my own property entirely. And I'll admit there's a particular satisfaction in knowing my access code now works precisely because a properly recorded agreement guarantees it, rather than because an association board simply hasn't gotten around to restricting it yet. My father built that road with equipment he owned outright, on land that belonged to him alone, decades before anyone had ever heard of Emberwood Ridge. And there's something fitting, I think, in the fact that it took 34 years of my own career spent untangling exactly this kind of dispute to finally settle, once and for all, whose road it actually always was. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever had a neighbor or an association assume ownership over something that was never actually theirs to claim. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.